I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest as the door clicked shut behind me. I had forgotten my purse, but when I returned, I heard their voices, my own son and his wife, whispering in the shadows. Just a few more months and she'll be gone. Then it's all ours. My hands trembled as I realized everything I thought I knew was a lie. That night, I didn't just change my purse, I changed my will. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Elaine's pace slowed as she reached the street corner, the weight of the evening pressing against her. The diner was just a few blocks away, a small comfort she had come to rely on, a quiet escape where everything felt predictable. But halfway down the street, it hit her. She felt a sudden coldness creep into her chest, a realization that stopped her in her tracks. Her purse. She hadn't grabbed it. It was still on the kitchen counter, sitting where she'd left it in her rush to get out the door. She cursed softly to herself, fingers curling into fists. Of course she had forgotten it, the one thing she couldn't leave behind. With a frustrated sigh, she turned back, retracing her steps, the rhythm of her boots clicking against the pavement, the sound far louder than it should have been in the quiet night. She could almost feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her, the urgency of her return at odds with the stillness of the evening. The thought of having to walk back again, having to deal with the awkward exchange with the waitress, made her want to scream. But it wasn't the purse that was bothering her. It was the unsettled feeling creeping up her spine, the same one she'd been trying to ignore all week. She turned back into her building. The hallway familiar in its emptiness. The elevator was still out of order. She didn't mind. She liked the quiet, the time to collect herself before the chaos of the apartment. But as she approached her door, something stopped her. A voice. Elaine froze. She wasn't sure why, but she instinctively leaned in closer, ears straining to catch the words. The conversation was low, a murmur just above the level of being caught in the air. It sounded distant, soft, but sharp. It was a voice she recognized immediately. Renee. Her heart seemed to skip a beat as the words floated through the door. Just a few more months. Renee's voice trembled. But it wasn't the kind of trembling that came with nervousness. No, this was something else. Something that seemed too intimate, too secret for the air between them. Elaine didn't move. Her chest tightened, and her breath caught in her throat. Then she heard Sean's voice, closer this time, steady and sure. We'll finally be free. No more diapers, and the house will be ours. The words hit her like a slap. They weren't for her, not for her at all. The sudden understanding cut through her, sharp and clean, like a knife through fabric. Elaine stood frozen, unable to tear herself away, but knowing she had to. She backed away from the door slowly. Carefully, her heart hammering in her chest. The rhythm of her pulse was deafening, drowning out the quiet hum of the apartment building. It was as if she had just stumbled into a secret she was never meant to hear. Her mind spun, trying to piece together what she'd just overheard. But there was no room for reasoning, no room for understanding. Just the cold realization that everything she thought she knew, everything she thought was solid, wasn't. The walls she had trusted to hold her world together were crumbling. Sean and Renee, whatever they were planning, whatever they had been planning for months, had nothing to do with her. She was a ghost in her own life, nothing more than an accessory to the plans they had made. The house, the diapers, the freedom. It all sounded so ordinary to anyone else. But for Elaine, it was a revelation, a chasm opening beneath her feet. With her heart racing, she slipped back into the hall, out the door, her every step quieter than the last. She didn't want them to know she was there, didn't want them to know she'd overheard their plans. But more than that, she didn't want to face the truth of it. Her breath was shallow as she left the building, stepping back into the cold night air. The streetlights were fuzzy in her peripheral vision, their light dim and distant. She walked toward the diner, the familiar building looming up ahead, but she couldn't shake the sense that everything was somehow off now. The walk felt longer than it should have. The night felt heavier. By the time she reached the diner, she felt hollow, like a shell of the person who had left earlier. She slid into the booth by the window and ordered a slice of pie, the same as always, trying to make everything feel like it had before. But even the pie didn't taste right. The waitress set the plate in front of her, and Elaine barely noticed the way the sweet smell of cinnamon and apples drifted through the air. She couldn't bring herself to pick up the fork. Her hand sat limply in her lap, the soft tremor barely noticeable. The world outside the window felt so distant, so foreign. She should have been present, should have found comfort in the routine, but there was none. Just the hollow silence and the knowledge that nothing would be the same anymore. Her fork clinked lightly against the plate as she finally picked it up, taking a small bite, but it tasted of nothing. The sweetness of the pie couldn't mask the bitter taste of the words she'd overheard. She barely tasted it, and she didn't know if she ever would again. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Elaine stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the house greeting her like an old, too-tight sweater. It smelled like dinner, roast chicken, potatoes, the faint undercurrent of garlic. She paused, hesitating just for a moment. The quiet was different tonight, heavier, more suffocating. "Hey, you're home." Sean's voice cut through the silence, too bright, too eager. His presence was a quiet weight on her chest, a reminder of everything she had just heard. "Yeah," she murmured, forcing a smile, smoothing it across her face like a mask. She had perfected the smile, the one that hid everything from him. From them. But she couldn't hide the gnawing ache inside her, not tonight. Sean was sitting at the kitchen table, picking at his food, the clink of his fork against the plate, the only sound in the room. Elaine lingered by the doorway, still unsure if she even wanted to be here, wanted to be part of whatever this was anymore. But she knew what was expected. She always did. "You okay, Mom? You're quiet tonight," Sean asked, his voice a little too concerned, like he was trying to pull her back into the fold, into the warmth of the family that didn't seem to want her anymore. Elaine nodded, the smile frozen on her lips. "I'm fine." The words were automatic, too rehearsed, but they didn't make it true. She felt far from fine. She sat down at the table, lifting her fork slowly, but the food on her plate, once so familiar, now felt like ash in her mouth. Her appetite had vanished, stolen away by the words she couldn't unhear. No more diapers. And the house will be ours. They hadn't even realized how loud they were, how their words had shattered the delicate quiet of the apartment, how they'd unwittingly cracked open something inside her, something that could never be put back together. Her eyes flicked to Sean, who was shoveling food into his mouth, talking aimlessly about work, about the kids, about things that felt so trivial compared to the storm brewing inside her. He didn't know, couldn't know. Elaine excused herself from the table, her heart racing, and slipped into the kitchen to clear her plate. She didn't want to hear any more. She needed to get out. The dishes clattered in the sink as she rinsed them, her movements mechanical, as if the rhythm of washing the plates could drown out the noise in her head. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was. She glanced at the door, eyes darting toward the porch. The cold night air, the emptiness beyond, felt like the only place she could breathe. She knew what she had to do. The quiet was choking her. Without saying anything, without another word to Sean or the kids, Elaine grabbed her jacket and slipped out the back door, her fingers fumbling as she tugged it on. The air was crisp against her skin, the kind of cool that bit at your cheeks and left them tingling. She barely noticed. Her head was spinning too much. The porch felt like a refuge, even though the night sky above felt impossibly distant. She leaned against the railing, the wood rough beneath her palms. For a moment, she just stood there, trying to steady her breath, trying to still the pounding of her heart. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she didn't have to check to know who it was. Michelle. It had to be. She pulled the phone from her jacket, the screen lighting up with Michelle's name. She didn't even wait to hear it ring once before she answered. "I'm glad you called," Michelle's voice came through, steady, warm. Let's meet tomorrow. Elaine let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. It wasn't much, but it was something. A lifeline. Tomorrow, Elaine whispered, her voice barely more than a thread in the cool air. I need you to meet me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Michelle's silence spoke volumes. She didn't need to say it. Elaine could hear the concern, the unspoken question. But Elaine didn't have the energy to explain it all. Not tonight. Not yet. I'm not gone yet, Elaine said, more to herself than to Michelle. She didn't know why she said it. Why those words, in that moment? Maybe it was a promise, or maybe it was a lie. She didn't know anymore. She ended the call without another word, the phone still pressed to her ear, as if holding on just a little longer could give her the clarity she was searching for. But the words she'd overheard, "We'll finally be free," kept echoing in her mind, louder and louder, drowning out the silence of the porch. No more diapers, and the house will be ours. The house. It wasn't just a house, it was their future, their escape, everything that didn't include her. Elaine gripped the phone tighter, the cool metal pressing into her palm as she stared into the darkness ahead, her heart heavy with the weight of it. The words she'd overheard had cracked her open, but there was nothing left inside but a void. The front door creaked open behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know that Sean had come looking for her. The warmth of the house was calling her back, but Elaine stayed where she was, staring into the dark. She wasn't sure she wanted to go back. Elaine woke up to the quiet hum of the house, the sunlight creeping in through the curtains. She didn't remember falling asleep. The night had slipped away from her as she sat in the darkness, staring at the lockbox on the shelf, listening to the distant sound of Sean snoring in the bedroom. The weight of everything, what she had overheard, what she had discovered about her own life, hung like a shadow over her. She hadn't been able to shake it, not a single moment. The words "no more diapers" and "the house will be ours" kept clawing at her mind, echoing endlessly, the pieces of her life falling away like dust. The small routine she had spent years building had crumbled so effortlessly. She had stood there on the porch last night, gripping her phone, telling Michelle she would do it, quietly take control of her own life again. But even that hadn't been enough to silence the doubt that gnawed at her. She had never known how fragile everything really was, how much she had been ignored, shut out, and now betrayed. She moved through the house with a sense of urgency, but also with care, like she was trying not to disturb the delicate balance of the silence she'd created. Sean and the kids were still asleep, and the house seemed too still, too empty without the sound of their chatter, their clinking of dishes. As she passed the kitchen, her eyes flicked to the counter, to the small lockbox sitting inconspicuously in the corner. She felt an odd sense of calm wash over her as she approached it, as if this small, unassuming thing was the key to her own sense of control, the key to her escape from the suffocating world she had lived in for so long. She had bought it at Walmart yesterday, a small silver box that could hold her secrets, could hold her thoughts, a space where she could keep the things she was afraid to say out loud, the things she wasn't even sure she could admit to herself. It was meant to be a safeguard, a place where she could store the journal, the words she had written, her unfiltered thoughts, that had slowly become her lifeline. But now, with the box sitting there, locked and secure, Elaine realized it was more than just a container for words. It was a symbol of the things she was no longer willing to let go of the things she was no longer willing to pretend weren't true. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool metal, and for a moment, she hesitated. She had locked away her truths, her emotions, the pieces of herself she had never been able to share with anyone, especially not Sean. She thought of Renee's voice, soft and conspiratorial, echoing in her mind again. She thought of Sean's face, the forced smile that he gave her when she walked in last night. They thought she didn't know, thought she couldn't feel the distance between them, but she did. She had always known. With a steadying breath, Elaine opened the box. Inside, she found the journal she'd been writing in for months. The words inside were her rawest, most vulnerable self, unsanitized and unfiltered. But now she needed more than just those thoughts. She needed something more, something permanent. She tucked the journal into the box and locked it again. Making sure the key was safely in her pocket, she felt the weight of it, the lockbox, the journal, the key, in the pit of her stomach, like a promise to herself. There was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, she slipped out to Walmart again, feeling like an imposter in the aisles of ordinary shoppers, picking up necessities. Her steps quickened as she approached the home office section, where blank notebooks sat stacked neatly on shelves. Like they had no secrets to hide. She selected one. A simple, plain notebook. No markings. Nothing to distinguish it from the others. This would be her new journal. But this time, the pages wouldn't be filled with the same raw honesty. This time, she would write in code. Something no one could decipher. Not Sean, not Renee, not anyone. The truth would be hers, alone. At home? She sat in the bedroom, staring at the new journal in her hands. She hadn't even begun to write in it yet. Instead, she thought of Michelle's voice on the other end of the phone earlier, her promise to help, to guide Elaine through the next phase. The plan. I'm not gone yet. She whispered those words to herself, over and over, as she started to write. This time, the words wouldn't just be confessions. They would be a blueprint, a structure, a path toward the life she was finally going to carve for herself, quietly, without fanfare. After finishing the first page, she set the notebook aside and dialed Michelle again. This time, more confident, more sure of her words. I want to restructure everything, quietly, Elaine said. The words were firm, final. There was no hesitation now. I'm done pretending. I'm done letting them think they can control me. Michelle was silent for a moment, but Elaine could feel the shift, the recognition in her friend's voice. I'm with you. Just say the word. Elaine's breath caught, her heart thumping in her chest as the weight of it settled over her. She was doing this. She was moving forward, breaking free, taking control. As she ended the call, a small voice from the doorway caught her attention. Mom. Elaine turned to see Ellie, standing in the hallway, her eyes curious and wide, watching her closely. Elaine's stomach tightened. She hadn't meant for Ellie to notice, hadn't meant for her to see this shift, this change that had been brewing inside her, but she saw it now, the subtle difference in Elaine's posture, the way she was holding herself differently, the way she was quieter, more focused. Are you okay? Ellie asked, her voice soft, tentative. Elaine smiled, her fingers instinctively reaching for the journal she'd just finished writing in. She set it aside carefully before glancing at her daughter. I'm fine, honey, she said, her voice more controlled than she felt. Just thinking about some things. I'm getting everything together. Ellie nodded, though her eyes seemed to linger on Elaine for just a moment longer, as if she knew something had changed. Elaine smiled again, the words I'm not gone yet whispering in her mind. Not gone yet. Not yet. Elaine's hands shook as she wrapped the warm cookies in a dish towel, their sweet scent filling the air. She hadn't meant to bake them. She had only intended to bring over a small favor, a polite gesture to ease the tension that had settled between her and Tom. But somehow, baking had become something she did when she couldn't think clearly. It was a simple thing, a mindless thing that grounded her. As she drove to Tom's house, the weight of the conversation she'd had with Michelle this morning pressed against her ribs. She'd felt the need to take action, take control for once. And with Michelle's help, she'd made sure everything was locked down. The bank accounts, the policies, even Sean's access. It wasn't enough to just think it. She needed to know that if push came to shove, she could protect herself. But it was Tom's question that still reverberated in her mind. Sean asked if your policy had a payout clause on natural death. The words had knocked the air out of her, leaving her dizzy. She'd tried to ignore it, to brush it off, but it had crawled under her skin, itching like a rash she couldn't scratch. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled into Tom's driveway. Her mind racing. She had always trusted him, believed that he was on her side. But that question, had turned everything upside down. She knocked on the door, cookies in hand, a smile already half formed on her lips. Tom opened it almost immediately, his face lighting up as soon as he saw her. "Elaine, hey, I wasn't expecting you today. What's this?" He gestured to the cookies. "Just a little something to thank you for helping me out," she said, pushing the cookies into his hands before he could protest. "But there's something we need to talk about." Tom looked at her, the easy warmth on his face fading into something more cautious. "Of course. Come on in." Elaine stepped inside, but her stomach twisted tighter as she followed him to the kitchen. She set her purse down and took a deep breath. She hadn't planned on this conversation, but now that she was here, she had to ask. "Tom, about the question you asked me last week." Her voice faltered for a second, but she steadied it, looking him straight in the eye. "What did you mean when you said Sean asked if my policy had a payout clause for natural death?" Tom's face went blank for a split second before he turned away. He set the cookies down on the kitchen counter and ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "Elaine, Don't lie to me, Tom," she cut in, her voice sharp, her chest tight with a sudden wave of nausea. "I need to know. What did Sean ask you?" He sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the question had pressed down on him too. He didn't look at her as he answered, but she could hear the heaviness in his words. He wanted to know if your life insurance had a clause for natural death. He was worried about the payout if something happened to you. Elaine's stomach twisted as the words sank in. It was exactly what she had feared, exactly what her gut had been screaming at her all along. He wasn't just planning for something to happen to her, he was calculating it. She stood frozen, the air in the room growing thick, suffocating. For a moment she could barely breathe. She had always suspected that something was off, that the distance between them, the coldness in Sean's eyes, wasn't just normal tension in a marriage. But this was something else entirely. She felt the sickness rise, but then something else followed, a cold, solid clarity. This was what it had all been leading up to. She wasn't going to let him have the power anymore. She wasn't going to wait around for him to take control of her life, her body, her future. Her phone was already in her hand before she realized it. She dialed Michelle's number, her fingers shaking slightly as she pressed the call button. "Michelle," she said, her voice firm now, cutting through the fog of uncertainty. "I need you to freeze all access to my accounts, and I want you to revoke Sean's power of attorney. I don't care what it takes. Just get it done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Michelle's voice, calm but heavy with understanding. "Elaine, you're sure about this?" "I'm sure." Elaine's voice was steady now, the adrenaline coursing through her. "Do it. Now." Tom had moved to the other side of the room, his back turned to her, but Elaine could still feel the weight of his gaze. He had known something, knew it long before she had, and now it was too late. She ended the call and tucked her phone back into her pocket. Taking another deep breath, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something huge, something that was going to change everything. She wasn't sure how it would play out, but she was ready. That evening, at dinner, Sean's casualness hit her like a slap. He was laughing, cracking jokes as usual, his voice carrying too much in the quiet of their kitchen. Elaine barely touched her food. Her mind was too far away, too focused on the plan she'd just set in motion. Sean's voice cut through her thoughts, too loud, too uncaring. "Don't die before Ellie graduates, huh?" It was supposed to be a joke, a harmless joke, like always, but this time it was a punch in the gut, a reminder that all his words, his smiles, his gestures, were just part of the game, part of the act. Elaine's hand trembled as she set down her fork, the sharp clink of it against the plate cutting through the tension. "Funny," she said, her voice cold, controlled. You're not as funny as you think. Sean's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough. Elaine stood up, the weight of the night pressing against her chest. The question they shouldn't have asked had been answered. The pieces were in motion, and for the first time in a long while, Elaine felt like she was finally in control. The game had changed. The phone buzzed in Elaine's pocket as she stepped into the living room, the hum of the house a sharp contrast to the quiet chaos swirling inside her. Michelle's message had come through late last night, a simple confirmation that the work was underway. The trust is set up. Everything is now irrevocable. You're in control. Elaine stood for a moment, letting the weight of it settle in, the sensation that for the first time in years, she was making the decisions, not Sean. The air in the room felt a little cleaner now, like the curtain had been drawn back to reveal the truth. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She glanced at the framed family photos on the mantel. She'd put those pictures up years ago, before the cracks in their marriage had grown too large to ignore. Now they seemed like relics from another life, one where she was content to stand in the background. But not anymore. Not after the questions Tom had posed. Not after Michelle's careful guidance. Now she was in the driver's seat. Elaine took a deep breath and dialed Michelle's number. The line rang twice before Michelle picked up, her voice calm, steady. "Elaine, everything's in place." Elaine's stomach tightened with the realization that the final pieces had clicked into place. "Tell me again what you've done." "We've transferred the house title out of Sean's name," Michelle began. "And I've made sure the property is now solely under your name. His addition to the deed was incomplete, so we caught that in time. That was the first priority. The second." "Sean and Renee," Elaine interrupted, her voice steady but strained. "You've cut them off from all beneficiary designations?" "Yes," Michelle confirmed, the word firm. "They're no longer listed. Everything has been restructured to your benefit. You remain the trustee of the irrevocable trust, meaning you're the sole decision-maker no matter what happens." Elaine let the relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. She knew there was still work to be done. "And Ellie?" Elaine asked. "What about her?" "We've set up the education trust. It's conditional, meaning the funds will only be accessible through your discretion. You can ensure her future, but Sean has no access. He can't touch it unless you approve it." Elaine nodded, her mind racing through every detail. This was her way of ensuring Ellie had a life beyond the mess Sean had created. Her daughter deserved better than to be caught in the crossfire of adult decisions. "I've also gone ahead and updated your will," Michelle added. "A medical evaluation was done. It certifies your full capacity. Everything is legally sound. No one can challenge it." Elaine's throat tightened. "You did all this without telling Sean?" Michelle's silence was telling. "It had to be done quickly. I didn't want to give him any room to manipulate things further." Elaine swallowed hard, taking a long moment to absorb the gravity of what had just happened. This was a pivotal point in her life. The reality that she'd been living on the edge of for so long was now unavoidable. Sean and Renee had no idea what was coming, but Elaine was prepared. "I'm signing it today," Elaine said quietly, her fingers curling into fists. "Where's the notary?" "I've arranged for him to come to your house," Michelle said, her tone practical. "He'll meet you in the garage while Renee's at yoga. You'll sign it, and it'll be official. There's no going back." Elaine's chest tightened at the thought of her signature on the papers. This was her moment. This would ensure that everything was hers, that she was in control of her own fate. No one, not Sean, not Renee, could take that from her. She ended the call, her heart racing, but the sense of finality, the heavy weight of the decisions she'd made, steadied her. She had done what she needed to do. The trust, the will, the accounts, it was all in place. The future was hers to shape now. A few hours later, the doorbell rang, and Elaine stepped outside to greet the notary. She could hear the hum of the street as she approached the garage, the faint sound of Renee's car pulling away. the familiar rush of the morning settling into an eerie calm. The notary, a nondescript man in his mid-40s, offered a smile and handed her the paperwork. She glanced at it, but her hands shook slightly. She was ready, but the weight of the moment still lingered. "Everything's in order, Miss Daniels," the notary said with a polite nod. "Whenever you're ready." Elaine stepped forward, feeling the cool surface of the desk under her palms as she signed the documents. The pen felt heavy in her hand, like it had the power to erase the life she'd once known. Each stroke of the pen, each signature, was a step further into the life she was finally taking for herself. The notary gathered the papers, and she tucked the sealed documents into a folder. "It's all set," he said, his voice almost too casual for the gravity of the moment. Elaine nodded, her heart pounding as she took the folder from him, the weight of it pulling her into reality. She felt the finality settle in, a mixture of relief and terror, all of it tangled up in her chest. As she closed the garage door behind her, the weight of the morning seemed to lift for just a moment. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Renee wouldn't be back for at least an hour, and Sean, well, he was at work, still oblivious to everything that had just transpired. Elaine took a deep breath. She was standing on the edge now, poised to step into the unknown, but she was ready. She had made her choices, taken control. The pieces were in motion, and nothing could stop her. But even as she stood there, feeling the calm settling into her bones, a flicker of doubt crept into the corners of her mind. Had she done enough? Would it be enough? And in that moment, a quiet realization hit her. The hardest part was still ahead. The door slammed open with such force that the frame rattled. Renee's face was flushed, her eyes wide with fury as she stormed into the room, hands planted firmly on her hips. "Did you do something to our credit?" she demanded, her voice sharp, accusing. Elaine stood frozen, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. For a split second, she almost let the fear creep in. She had been anticipating this moment, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. "Not your credit," Elaine replied coolly, her voice steady as she set down the cup of tea she'd been holding. She met Renee's glare without flinching. "Just protected mine." Renee opened her mouth to retort, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Sean, standing just behind Renee in the doorway, didn't say anything at all. His face was a mask of controlled panic, eyes darting between Elaine and Renee, clearly unsure of how to play this game. Elaine could feel the shift in the room. The power had just changed hands, and they both knew it. "I told you she would do something," Renee muttered, her voice dripping with frustration. But there was something else underneath. Fear, maybe. The thought that Elaine was no longer just the woman she could ignore or manipulate, but someone who could act decisively. Elaine didn't let herself react. She took a slow breath, pushing the flood of emotions down deep where they wouldn't show. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone calm, dismissive. She met Sean's eyes for a brief second, and in that split moment, she saw it, the subtle shift of concern, the realization that something had changed, something they couldn't undo. "You're hiding things from us," Renee continued, voice rising in frustration. But Elaine was already thinking ahead, already thinking about the steps she had taken over the past few days. She reached for her phone, fingers tapping the screen as she made the call. She had been preparing for this, anticipating their next move. As the phone rang, the weight of the decision hit her again. She had done everything, frozen the accounts, secured her assets, ensured that her life wasn't dependent on their control anymore. But she needed to make sure that they couldn't touch anything. Not now. Not ever again. Elaine came the familiar voice of the bank representative when the call was answered. She smiled slightly to herself. This was another box checked off. "Hi, it's Elaine Daniels. I need to confirm something regarding my old joint account with Sean Daniels. I'd like to ensure that no co-signing exists on any active accounts. And I need to make sure there are no shared lines of credit still open between us." The representative confirmed, and as she listened to the reassuring details, Elaine felt the last vestiges of doubt slip away. They couldn't touch her financial foundation. She had separated herself completely, ensuring that no matter what happened next, she was protected. She ended the call with a sense of quiet relief. She turned back to Renee and Sean, who were still standing in the doorway, watching her as if they had no idea what to expect from her now. She didn't let her gaze falter. "I've also taken the liberty of changing my mailing address to a P.O. box," Elaine continued, her voice light but laced with a quiet finality. "It's set up through a private service, one that's handled by someone I trust." Renee opened her mouth to protest again, but Sean stepped forward, his usual arrogance replaced by something darker. He was clearly worried now. His jaw clenched tightly, and he finally spoke, his voice tight. "What are you doing, Elaine? What is this all about?" Elaine took a slow step forward, her gaze locking onto Sean's. "I'm protecting myself. Something you should have done a long time ago." Renee scoffed, clearly rattled by the turn of events. "So what, you're just going to cut us off? You think you can just take everything and leave us with nothing?" Elaine felt the familiar stir of frustration inside her, but she tamped it down. She didn't need to explain herself. Not to Renee, not to Sean. "I'm not leaving you with nothing," Elaine replied coolly, stepping around them both. "I'm leaving you with what you deserve." With that, she moved towards the hallway, her mind already turning to the next step. But she wasn't ready to give in just yet. Not to Sean, not to Renee. As she rounded the corner into the living room, the doorbell rang, and Ellie's voice called from the other room. "Mom, who's here?" Elaine froze, her heart skipping a beat. Ellie. The door was still open, and the tension was thick enough to cut through. The last thing Elaine wanted was for Ellie to feel it. She didn't want her daughter caught up in the chaos, in the ever-growing storm that was her life. But she knew that Ellie was already noticing the cracks, already seeing the distance between her parents. Elaine quickly composed herself, but the words Ellie asked next hit her harder than she expected. "Is everything okay?" Ellie's voice was soft, a mixture of curiosity and concern, her small figure appearing in the doorway. Elaine swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to mask the heaviness in her chest. Her eyes softened as she looked at her daughter, her heart aching with the desire to protect her from it all. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Elaine said, forcing a smile as she knelt to meet Ellie's gaze. "Everything's fine. Just a little adult stuff." Ellie studied her brow furrowed in concern, but after a long beat, she nodded slowly. "Okay, Mom. But you don't have to do everything by yourself." Elaine's smile wavered, a lump forming in her throat. She reached out and cupped Ellie's face gently, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "I'm not doing it by myself, honey," Elaine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I have you, and I have me." Ellie smiled softly, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. Elaine's heart twisted in her chest as her daughter turned and walked back down the hall, but the truth was undeniable. Elaine had made her choice. The power was hers now, but the hardest part was still to come. And she had no idea just how far Sean and Renee would push her to keep control of everything they thought they were owed. The senior community was a place that felt timeless, the air heavy with peace. A soft hum of quiet conversations and footsteps. Elaine stepped through the entrance, the cool breeze from the nearby lake rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the courtyard. It was exactly what she needed. Clean, calm, and private. Everything the world she had left behind was not. She walked slowly, taking in the grounds. A pond glittered in the sunlight, its surface barely rippling. The low hum of a lawnmower blended with the occasional chirp of birds. There were no screams, no tension, no passive-aggressive whispers. Nothing. It was a reprieve from the life she had fought so hard to leave behind. Elaine's heart thudded in her chest as she signed the lease, her signature neat and deliberate. The space was small, perfect really. A cozy apartment, clean lines, large windows that overlooked the lake. She didn't need much anymore, just a place to breathe, to reclaim her life without the constant shadow of Sean and Renee hanging over her. The next 2 weeks would be a whirlwind, but she could do this. She had to do this. The leasing agent handed her the keys, and for the first time in months, Elaine felt a sense of ownership, not just of the place, but of herself. This was her life now. It would be her decision whether anyone else could come along for the ride. "I'll transfer the security deposit today," Elaine told the agent, her voice steady. The words were final, definitive. She was no longer part of the chaotic mess that had defined her marriage. She had escaped, or at least she would. Back home, the house felt wrong. Every step Elaine took seemed louder than it should have been. The rooms she had lived in for so many years were now foreign, a shell of what they had once been. She couldn't even look at the walls anymore without remembering the times Sean had been too busy, too absent to notice her presence, or worse, when Renee's presence had filled the air instead. She walked into the living room, her phone vibrating in her pocket. It was Michelle, again. "Elaine, I've made the transfers." Michelle's voice came through the speaker, confident, reassuring. "All documents related to the trust are now redirected to your new P.O. box. No one will be able to trace them back." Elaine's fingers brushed against the edge of the couch, her mind still racing. "Good," she replied softly. "Thank you." She stood there, staring out the window, the same window where she had once stood, holding her breath as Sean and Renee plotted a future that didn't include her. Now it was different. It was her future to create. No one would dictate what happened next. Later that evening, the house was quieter than usual. Sean was still out with friends, leaving Elaine the solitude she needed to begin the next phase. She grabbed a box from the garage and began filling it with her personal belongings. It was a simple task, but the act of boxing up her life felt like taking one more step away from the life she had known, and one more step toward freedom. She folded the last of her favorite sweaters and placed it gently in the box when she heard Ellie's voice from the hallway. "Mom?" Ellie's voice cracked with the kind of quiet concern Elaine had become accustomed to. Elaine froze. She hadn't meant for Ellie to see the boxes, the packing. Everything was happening too fast. She hadn't thought about how it might feel for her daughter to witness it all. The last thing Elaine wanted was to hurt Ellie. But the truth had been hanging in the air between them for weeks, and now it was spilling out. Elaine turned slowly, meeting her daughter's eyes. There was a tremble in her voice, but her resolve was strong. "What is it, sweetheart?" Ellie stood in the doorway, her small figure tense, her brow furrowed with confusion. "Are you leaving me?" The words hit Elaine like a punch in the stomach. She had never wanted to hurt her daughter, never wanted to tear apart the world Ellie had always known. But the truth was inevitable. Elaine's heart twisted as she walked over to Ellie, kneeling down to meet her gaze. Her fingers reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's forehead. She had to make this right. She had to protect Ellie from this storm, even if it meant breaking her own heart. "No, baby, I'm not leaving you," Elaine said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm just changing zip codes." Ellie didn't look convinced. Her small hands wrung together nervously as she took a step back. "But why? Why do you have to go?" Elaine's chest tightened with the weight of it all. She knew Ellie didn't fully understand that this was all too much for her to comprehend. But Elaine couldn't lie to her, not now. "I'm doing this because I need to be in a place where I can breathe, Ellie. I can't be in that house anymore, not with everything that's happened." Ellie nodded slowly, but her eyes were still full of worry. Elaine could see the confusion in her daughter's gaze, and it made her ache. "I'll always be here for you, sweetheart," Elaine whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This place isn't just for me. It's for us." Ellie gave her a small, unsure smile, but the sadness lingered in her eyes. She turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. Elaine watched her go, her heart heavy. This wasn't how she imagined her life turning out. This wasn't the life she had wanted for her daughter, but there was no turning back now. As the door clicked shut behind Ellie, Elaine stood up, walking over to the box she had filled with her things. She lifted the lid, but before she could put anything more inside, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Michelle. "Everything's set for the move." The keys are in the mail. Elaine stood there, staring at the message, her heart pounding in her chest. It was real now. She was leaving. The hardest part was behind her, but the hardest part was still ahead. And she had no idea just how deep the storm would go. The air in the house felt thick, too close, like something was pressing against Elaine's chest. It had been days since she'd moved her things into the new place, the senior community just a few miles away, but she hadn't felt ready to face Sean. Not until now. She stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes lingering on the empty space where they'd once built their life together, where she had imagined they would grow old. That life was gone now, replaced by a strange calm, a quiet she hadn't known in years. The walls were still familiar, but they no longer held the weight of shared memories. They felt cold. She had planned this moment for days, rehearsed her words over and over, yet as Sean entered the room, his face blank, his eyes distant, everything she had prepared seemed to vanish in the haze of the moment. He shut the door behind him, his posture defensive, as if he knew something was about to change, but he wasn't sure how. "Sit down," Elaine said quietly, her voice steady but cutting through the silence that filled the space between them. He glanced at her but didn't move. "Please." He sank into the couch, but his discomfort was palpable. The tension between them was thick enough to suffocate. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Elaine held up her hand. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "I'm here to show you something." Sean raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical, but curiosity flickered in his eyes. "What is it?" Elaine walked to the counter, picking up her phone. She tapped the screen, scrolling to the voice memo she'd saved months ago. She knew the moment she hit play, there would be no turning back. She pressed the button, and the sound of Renee's voice filled the room. "Just a few more months." Sean's voice followed, calm, even. "We'll finally be free. No more diapers. And the house will be ours." The words slammed into the air between them, sharp, brutal. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still. She had to finish this. The recording continued. A few seconds more. Then, the phone went quiet. Sean shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his hands twitching. "Elaine, come on. We were joking." Elaine cut him off, her voice rising. "No, Sean. You said I was furniture with a ticking clock. That's not a joke." "That's how you see me." His face paled, his lips parted. And for a moment, he looked like he had been hit, but he recovered quickly, straightening himself up. "You're blowing this out of proportion. We were just talking." "Don't," Elaine said firmly. "Don't pretend it was nothing. You knew exactly what you were saying." She took a deep breath, fighting the wave of anger threatening to rise. "And you've been planning this for months, haven't you?" Sean's expression shifted to something harder, defensive. He opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the chance. "Do you want to know how I know you didn't care about me?" Elaine continued, her voice icy. "Because you didn't even bother to hide it. I had to overhear it to understand how little I meant to you." The weight of her words landed heavily in the room, and Sean seemed to shrink. But it wasn't pity she felt. Not anymore. Elaine took a step forward, her voice quieter but unwavering. "I'm done, Sean. I'm not going to fight with you. I'm not going to explain myself anymore. It's over." She took a long pause, letting it sink in. She watched as his face twisted, a mix of guilt and frustration. She knew what he was thinking. She could see it in his eyes, the struggle to regain control, to get her to believe his excuses. But there were no more lies left to tell. "Here's the name of the attorney you'll need," Elaine continued, reaching into her purse and sliding a business card across the table. "Not mine. You'll need your own." Sean's hand hovered over the card, but he didn't take it. "Elaine, wait. You can't just—" "I already have," Elaine interrupted, her tone cold, final. "This isn't about you. This is about me. And I'm done being your afterthought." Sean opened his mouth again, but this time he stayed silent. A strange look passing between them, something like realization. Or maybe just the remnants of all the words left unspoken. He didn't move, didn't try to stop her, but she could see the control slipping from his grasp. Elaine stood there for a moment, waiting for some form of a reaction. Some last-ditch attempt to cling to the remnants of their past. But it didn't come. He just sat there, staring at her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. She nodded once, her face set in stone. "Goodbye, Sean." Turning away, Elaine walked toward the door, the sound of her footsteps seeming to echo in the emptiness that had grown between them. As she reached the threshold, she heard the faintest whisper of a protest, but she didn't turn back. She couldn't. She had come this far, and she wouldn't let him drag her back into that suffocating world. Just as she stepped outside, the door clicked closed behind her, and Elaine's chest tightened. The finality of it felt like a weight lifting, but there was a flicker of uncertainty at the edges. She had made the decision, and now there was no going back. As she walked down the driveway, the cool evening air brushing against her face, she realized that the hardest part wasn't facing Sean or Renee. It was facing herself. The truth she hadn't been willing to see. The truth she hadn't spared anyone, not even herself. But she had come this far. There was no turning back, and she wouldn't let anyone drag her down again. Elaine's footsteps echoed in the hallway of her new apartment as she moved through the space for the first time, carrying a box filled with the last remnants of her old life. Her life, was starting to take shape here. Each item, now placed carefully in its spot, was hers again. No shared space, no overlapping belongings. Everything felt like a clean slate. The air was different in this place. There was no tension, no accusations, no watching her every move. Just peace. She set the box down on the kitchen counter, the last piece of her move, and stood there for a moment, absorbing the stillness. The apartment was simple. Light wood floors, white walls, large windows that let the sun filter through, casting soft light across the space. The furniture was modest, but exactly what she wanted. No excess, no clutter, just the essentials. She had worked so hard for this, and now it was hers. The bedroom felt particularly comforting. She set her bag on the bed and then sat on the edge, her hands resting in her lap. For the first time in months, maybe longer, she felt in control of her surroundings. She didn't have to wait for someone else's approval. She didn't have to answer to anyone. She knew she had to start planning for Ellie's future. As soon as she'd settled in, she made the call to set up a discreet account for her daughter, a future fund that could be accessed only with Elaine's permission. No one would be able to touch it. Not Sean, not Renee, not now, not ever. She set the terms herself. Strict conditions that would ensure Ellie would have everything she needed, no matter what happened. Elaine had already transferred a portion of her savings, ensuring that Ellie's future would be secure, even if everything else fell apart. It was a small gesture of reassurance, but it was everything. Ellie didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of her parents' mistakes. Next, Elaine took a long look at her phone, scrolling through her emergency contacts. She had removed every family member. There was no room for Sean, no room for Renee in her life anymore. They were no longer her responsibility. She didn't need them to determine what happened next. As her finger hovered over their names, she deleted them from the list, the silence that followed oddly satisfying. Each deletion was a small victory, a promise she had made to herself. She was no longer defined by them. The sound of a knock at the door startled her, and she quickly stood up, smoothing her hands over her clothes. She had only just moved in, and the idea of meeting neighbors was almost foreign. But she wasn't the same person anymore. She was open to this, to new beginnings. She opened the door to find a pair of neighbors, an older woman with gray hair and a warm smile, and a man with a friendly wave. "Hi, I'm Carol," And this is my husband, David, the woman said brightly. We just wanted to stop by and introduce ourselves. Welcome to the building. Elaine smiled, genuinely this time, and stepped aside to let them in. They chatted for a few minutes about the community, the layout of the building, the book club they ran. Carol's enthusiasm was infectious, and David added an occasional light-hearted remarks. Elaine felt a warmth, a small but unmistakable shift, in the way she could now interact with people, no strings, no obligations. Would you be interested in joining the book club? Carol asked as they prepared to leave. We meet every Thursday at 7. It's just a nice, laid-back group of people who enjoy reading and talking. Elaine smiled. The idea of finding a space where she could just be herself both daunting and exciting. I'd love that, she said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. Thank you for welcoming me. David waved as they left, and Elaine closed the door, feeling something she hadn't expected, hope. The kind of hope that comes with embracing the future, even when it's uncertain. The following week, the phone buzzed again, and Elaine looked down to see an email from Michelle. She opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as she read. Your estate is now ironclad. Nicely done. Elaine let out a long breath, the weight of the message settling over her like a warm blanket. Everything was in place. No one could touch her now, not Sean, not Renee, not anyone. Her future was secure. The sound of the front door opening startled her, and she looked up to see Ellie walking in, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a tired smile on her face. The smile softened Elaine's heart in ways she hadn't been ready for. Hey, Mom, Ellie said. You home? I am, Elaine replied, her voice catching in her throat. She stood up and walked toward her daughter, wrapping her arms around her in a brief but tight hug. Ellie hugged her back, resting her head on Elaine's shoulder. You look happy here, Ellie said, pulling away slightly but still holding onto her mother's arm. Elaine smiled, the answer so easy, it surprised her. I am, sweetheart, I really am. She had done it. She had taken the hard steps. She had broken free, protected Ellie, and created a space for herself that was no longer dictated by the past. The weight of everything she had done, the changes, the choices, the challenges, were now just memories fading into the background of her life. But even as she basked in the relief of it all, she knew one thing for certain. The future would always hold surprises. The storm they'd created was still there, lurking, waiting, and as the weeks passed, she would need to keep one eye on the horizon, because while she had secured herself, her future, and Ellie's, she had no idea how far Sean and Renee would go to try to take it all back. Elaine stood at the door, her hand resting on the handle, her heart thudding louder than she cared to admit. The quiet of the apartment seemed too loud in this moment, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of traffic outside, all swirling around her as she faced the door. She had been expecting this, but now that it was here, it felt like everything she had worked for was on the edge of unraveling. The knock came again, this time more urgent. Renee's voice filtered through the wood, raw and strained. Elaine, please, open the door. We need to talk. Elaine took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the woman she used to be. She wasn't the one who had let Renee's words, her manipulations, chip away at her self-worth. No, she was someone else now, someone stronger, but she was still human, and the familiar pull of guilt tugged at her. She had loved this woman once, or at least had thought she had. She opened the door, just wide enough to see Renee standing there, her face flushed, eyes swollen from crying. She looked different, broken maybe, but the sting of her betrayal still burned deep inside Elaine. She didn't invite Renee in. Renee stepped forward, her hands raised in a pleading gesture, voice trembling. Please reconsider the will. I know you're angry, but we were stressed. We were under so much pressure. You have to understand. Elaine's lips pressed together in a tight line. Her pulse quickened as Renee's words washed over her, but they didn't land where they once would have. The past few weeks had stripped her of the power they once held over her. There was nothing left to give, nothing left to explain. Stress doesn't turn people cruel, Elaine said, her voice steady and cutting through the air between them. It reveals that they already were. Renee's face faltered, the tears that had pooled in her eyes slipping down her cheeks. For a moment, Elaine almost felt a flicker of pity. But that moment passed as quickly as it came. Renee had shown her true colors. She had no more sympathy left for her. "You don't understand," Renee whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "You don't know how hard this has been for us. For me. We didn't mean to hurt you. You were just there. You don't deserve this." Elaine's breath caught in her chest, but she didn't let herself flinch. "You were just there." Those words echoed in her mind. She had been a placeholder in her own life, a background character until she became inconvenient. She had let it happen. Until now. "No," Elaine replied firmly, each syllable a weight of its own. "I don't deserve this, and neither does Ellie." She stepped back from the door, letting the cool air from outside brush against her skin. "But I'm done with all of it. You don't get to keep pushing me into corners and then pretending it wasn't your choice." She paused, letting the words settle, then locked eyes with Renee, who was still standing there, rooted in the same spot. For a brief moment, Elaine wondered if Renee would fight back, or if she would crumble, but she already knew the answer. Renee didn't fight. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped, as though every ounce of hope she had been holding on to had just drained away. Elaine felt the finality of it. The door between them wasn't just wood and metal. It was everything that had built up between them, the lies, the manipulation, the years of resentment. And now the door closed, slowly, deliberately. The sound of it seemed too loud in the silence that followed, but it was the only sound that mattered. Click. Kotakar. The space between them was final. Elaine didn't look back as she locked the door. She had made her choice, and this was the last time she would ever let herself be anyone's second choice. Minutes later, Elaine's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Ellie. "I still want to visit." Elaine's chest tightened as she read the message, the warmth of her daughter's love still a beacon in this chaos. She had always been her constant, her anchor, and no matter what happened, no matter how many people tried to tear her apart, Elaine would never lose sight of that. She tapped out a reply, her fingers moving slowly but with purpose. "You always have a place with me, but not them." As she hit send, her heart skipped a beat, and she stared at the screen for a long moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't even just about Sean and Renee anymore. It was about the future she was building, the future she was protecting, for Ellie. Elaine set the phone down and stood at the window, her gaze drifting out toward the distant lake. The light was fading, the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. And for the first time in a long while, Elaine felt a sense of peace. But she also knew that peace was fragile. The storm wasn't over yet. And she would need every ounce of strength to face what was coming next. The door was closed, but the fight wasn't over, and Elaine had no intention of losing. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows across Elaine's small living room. She stood by the window, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the fabric, watching the steady rise and fall of the trees in the park across the street. She had been at peace for the past few weeks, but the silence was now something different. Too heavy, too fragile. She knew this calm wouldn't last. Not with Sean and Renee still lurking at the edges of her life, waiting to reclaim what they thought was theirs. The phone buzzed on the table beside her. She picked it up, seeing the message from Michelle, the lawyer who had been her lifeline throughout this entire process. The last layer of protection was about to be set in place. The trust has been updated with a no contest clause. Watertight. There's no way to challenge this without consequences. I've also included the statement of intent you asked for regarding documented manipulation. It's solid. Elaine let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was done. The final step had been taken. They couldn't touch her now. She knew Sean would try, though. He would fight for what he thought he was entitled to. But now, the playing field had changed. She wasn't afraid anymore. The document Michelle had sent over sat before her on the table, the text neatly typed in legal jargon that made her eyes glaze over. But she understood what it meant. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting Ellie, and this time, there was no going back. Elaine tapped a pen against the paper, her mind racing. She needed this final step to be as permanent as it could get. She wasn't just moving forward, she was closing off all avenues for them to find a way back into her life. With a finality that felt like a deep breath, she wrote in her own hand, "This statement is a reflection of my intent to remove Sean and Renee from any claim on my estate. Their actions have shown a pattern of manipulation and deceit. Their involvement with me, my finances, and my future has been nothing short of exploitation. This will stand as a testament to that fact." As she sipped her coffee, the news continued to trickle in. Sean's bankruptcy, Renee's car being repossessed, the whispers growing louder, but they didn't matter anymore. Their lives were spiraling, and Elaine could do nothing but watch from the outside. The peace she had worked so hard to create felt fragile, but it was hers. And no one, not Sean, not Renee, could take it from her. She glanced out the window, the sun shining brightly now, casting golden beams over the city. It was a beautiful day, a new day, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the future stretching ahead of her, full of possibilities. As she finished her coffee, Elaine stood, heading back to her apartment, back to her real home. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, it didn't matter. She was ready for it. But as she walked, her phone buzzed again. Another email from Michelle. It was short, direct, and as cold as it was final. "The final trust documents have been filed. No one can contest this now." Elaine stopped, staring at the words. The future was secure, and nothing could take it away from her. The storm that had once threatened to break her had passed. But what would they do next? Elaine sat at the small desk in her cozy apartment. The documents spread out before her in neat piles, each one a weighty testament to the decisions she had made. She had thought she was done, that everything had been finalized with the trust and the last legal step taken. But as she stared at the final estate plan, she realized something had changed. There was only one name on the list, Ellie. Her heart tightened as she scanned the document again. The legalities had been perfect, airtight, but in this moment, it felt more like an emotional milestone. Ellie was the only heir. No one else, no more claims, no more attempts to undo her future. Just Ellie. Elaine's fingers traced the edges of the page. The relief was undeniable. She had ensured that Ellie would be safe, protected, and free from the damage caused by her father and Renee. Her daughter would have the future they could never take from her, no matter what came next. But that wasn't enough. Elaine needed to leave something more than just money. She needed Ellie to know exactly who she was, who she had become, and why this had to happen. With a deep breath, Elaine picked up the pen and added another clause to the document, a donation. A legacy donation to a children's literacy nonprofit, one that had always spoken to her heart. It was something small but meaningful, something that could impact future generations. She paused after writing the final words and let the pen rest in her hand for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the window. The world outside was as it always had been, but Elaine knew she was no longer part of it in the same way. She had closed that chapter. The donation was more than just money. It was a piece of her heart. With one last stroke, she signed her name at the bottom of the page. This was her legacy now, one she could leave behind for Ellie to carry forward. The next step was less formal, but no less important. Elaine reached for a clean sheet of paper and began writing. The words flowed with ease, though they came from a place deep within her, a place she hadn't fully allowed herself to tap into before. She wrote a letter to herself, You outlived their expectations. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had endured. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the years of being treated as invisible. It all amounted to one thing: survival. She had outlived it all. And now, in this quiet apartment, with a life ahead of her that was finally her own, she could say it with conviction. You didn't just survive, you thrived. Despite it all, she paused, reading the words she had just written. This was a farewell of sorts, a goodbye to the woman who had let herself be walked over, to the woman who had tried to make everything right for everyone else. She wasn't that woman anymore. She was someone new, stronger, more certain. Elaine folded the letter and set it in the drawer next to her journal, the final words of a life she had lived and the beginning of one she had chosen. The next task was far more practical, but equally as important. Elaine pulled a flash drive from her desk drawer, the small device inconspicuous in her hand. She labeled it Ellie Only with a permanent marker, and she slid it into her laptop. Inside were all her journals, the rawest, most unfiltered versions of herself, the versions of Elaine that no one had ever seen. She knew Ellie would find it one day, when she was ready. It wasn't a confession, it was a legacy. The thoughts, the pain, the wisdom she had gathered. She wanted Ellie to know everything, to understand everything that had led them here. When the file was saved, Elaine tucked the flash drive into an envelope. It would be there when the time was right, waiting for her daughter. The phone buzzed, breaking the silence in the room. Elaine glanced at the screen. It was Michelle again, the lawyer who had seen her through this whole ordeal. Elaine had trusted her, and now she had one last task to complete. She replied quickly, typing out the final instructions for her burial preferences. Modest, private, no invite list. It wasn't that she didn't care about the people who had been in her life. She just didn't want the spectacle. She wanted her legacy to remain undisturbed, free from the prying eyes that had always sought to claim it. She was done with that. The last thing Elaine did was something she hadn't expected. She made a phone call. A call to a local florist. She ordered a small bouquet of flowers, vibrant and simple, with a message written on a card, for Ellie's graduation. Whenever it happens. She could feel the smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know when it would happen, didn't know where life would take them, but she knew this. Ellie would have everything she needed to succeed. Even if Elaine couldn't be there to witness it, the flowers would arrive, on time, just as she had planned. Elaine hung up the phone, a deep sense of peace settling over her. She had done everything she could to ensure Ellie would always have a future, no matter what came. The foundation was solid. There was nothing left for anyone to take. For the first time in years, Elaine felt her heart steady. She had finally built the life she deserved, the life she would share with Ellie, away from the chaos of the past. And as the evening sky turned dark outside her window, she allowed herself one final thought. The storm had passed, and the legacy she had fought so hard to create would live on. Elaine stared at the unopened letter on her desk, its edges sharp, the name on the envelope as familiar as the face of someone she had spent years trying to forget. Sean's handwriting, the same crude scrawl from countless messages past, taunted her from across the room. She had seen it the moment she opened the envelope, the desperate words, the pleading tone, but she did not reach for it. Instead, she sat in the stillness of her new home, her hands clasped in her lap. There was nothing more to say, nothing that could make this right, not anymore. The silence was her answer. He was still reaching for something she no longer had. Control, the pieces of a life that were no longer his. She couldn't bring herself to respond. Instead, she walked to the small desk near the kitchen, where her favorite pens rested beside a pile of unused notepads. Elaine took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She picked up a fresh post-it note and, with deliberate slowness, wrote a single line in bold, clear handwriting. Dignity is a one-way decision. It wasn't much, But it was everything. The truth she had known all along. The final decision. There was no going back, no reshaping what had been broken. The dignity she had fought for, the dignity she had reclaimed, was hers. And it was a line Sean had crossed too many times to ever find his way back. Elaine set the post-it down, the weight of her own words filling the room. She didn't need to say more, not to him, not to anyone. This was the end of that chapter, the last line she would ever write on that story. The autumn air brushed against her skin as Elaine stepped out onto her small porch. The birds were singing in the trees across the yard, their wings sweeping the morning light in graceful arcs. It was one of those perfect days, when the world seemed still but full of possibility. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the morning settle in her bones. This was freedom. There was no other word for it. She had been running from the past for years, quietly, relentlessly, but now she was home, a home that was hers alone, with no shadows, no lies, just the promise of something real, something lasting. Elaine smiled as she watched the birds flit from branch to branch. They didn't need permission. They didn't ask for anyone's approval. They were free. She was free. Later that week, Ellie arrived, her laughter spilling into the house the moment she walked through the door. The air in the apartment seemed to brighten, the heaviness lifting with every word they exchanged. They were settling into their new life, one that wasn't filled with the clutter of other people's expectations. "I think we need to decorate for fall," Ellie declared, already pulling out boxes from the closet that held ribbons, candles, and an assortment of handmade decorations they'd collected over the years. Elaine watched her daughter move about with ease, the space feeling like it had been hers all along. "You're right. We can hang the garland and the little pumpkins by the window," Elaine suggested. Stepping in to help, they worked together, filling the room with autumnal warmth. The scent of cinnamon candles lingering in the air as they laughed together. It felt normal, real, the kind of normal she had craved for so long. The light outside began to dim, casting golden hues through the window as they sat down with mugs of warm cider, the steam curling upward in soft swirls. The tension of the past few weeks faded, leaving room for the laughter, the small moments of joy. They looked through old photo albums, sharing stories from years past. Ellie's fingers traced the edges of a picture, her voice soft. "I remember this one," Ellie said, her smile wistful. "You and Dad at that picnic in the park. I used to think you were both so happy back then." Elaine's heart gave a small pang, but she let it pass, turning her attention back to the photos. "We were," she said simply. "We were happy for a while." But the past was just that, the past. As Ellie left for the evening, the air grew cooler and the house settled into a quiet that felt comforting, like a soft blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Elaine knew the journey wasn't over. There were still pieces to pick up, still moments where she'd have to remind herself of her strength. But for the first time, the weight of what had been felt lighter. In the stillness of the room, Elaine sat down at her desk, her fingers moving across the keys of her laptop. She opened her final journal entry, the one she had left for last, the one she had been avoiding. There were so many words left unsaid, so much she had kept to herself for fear of what it might mean. But now it was time to put it all down. She began to type, the words coming easily. "This is the life I have built. From the ashes of everything I thought I lost, I found myself again. And now I am whole." Elaine paused, staring at the screen for a moment. The finality of the words felt like a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She hit save. The quiet of the evening surrounded her, and as she closed her laptop, the house felt more like home than it ever had. The silence was no longer something to fear. It was her peace. But then her phone buzzed again. It was an email from Michelle. One final legal document. A confirmation that all the pieces were finally locked in place. Elaine opened it, her breath catching as she read the words. "Everything is final. Your foundation is now unbreakable. The world outside was still. She was still. And this time, nothing at all could take it away from her. But there was one thought that lingered, the one that made her heart race. What would Sean and Renee do next? The morning air was crisp, fresh with the promise of the day ahead. The lake shimmered gently under the pale glow of the rising sun, its surface smooth and reflective, like the calm Elaine felt in her chest. She stood at the edge of the water, her breath misting in the cool light, taking it all in. She had walked here every morning since she moved into the apartment, finding solace in the solitude. It had become her place, the one where everything was still, and for once, she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She wasn't waiting for someone to tell her she was worthy. She didn't need anyone's validation. The past had faded, leaving behind only the quiet certainty of her choices. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of a stone by the water's edge, the same stone she had touched the first time she came here. A small smile tugged at her lips as she thought about how far she'd come since that moment. But it wasn't just the lake that had changed her. It was the decision she had made, the one that set everything into motion. The moment she had stopped waiting, stopped begging for permission to exist on her own terms, her mind flashed back to that day, the day she had overheard Sean and Renee, the memory of her fingers hovering over the doorknob, poised to leave, to make her escape, to hear what was never meant for her ears. That moment had been the turning point, the one where she chose to act. She had gone back inside, though she'd thought she was only retrieving her purse. She smiled, remembering how that one small decision had altered everything. The purse was a convenient excuse, a reason to retreat. But what had really happened was that she had found herself. She had heard the truth, and in hearing it, she had begun rewriting her own future, not in a courtroom, not with screams and arguments, just decisions, quiet, firm, and deliberate decisions. Later that morning, after a peaceful breakfast and a few hours spent organizing the last of her things, Elaine walked into the small living room, where Ellie was sitting on the couch. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the letter would be handed over, the final piece of Elaine's legacy. Ellie looked up as she entered, her expression both eager and uncertain. She had seen the envelope, marked with her name in bold letters. She knew what it was, and she knew it was important. Elaine sat beside her, the room quiet except for the soft rustle of paper as Ellie gently opened the letter. Inside was the final inheritance instructions, the details of the trust Elaine had established, everything that was now Ellie's to manage, and the love that would always be there, unspoken, but ever present. Elaine watched as Ellie's eyes moved across the words, her fingers tracing the pages like she could feel the weight of them. Her daughter paused for a long time, reading the clause about how the funds would be released only when Ellie was ready, when she understood what had happened and why. It wasn't just a financial inheritance. It was a blueprint for the future, one that Ellie could shape as she saw fit. As Ellie finished reading, her gaze met Elaine's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not one of discomfort, but of understanding. They both knew what this meant. "You gave me everything," Ellie said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "even after they took you for granted." Elaine could only nod. It had always been for Ellie. She had fought for this life, for this moment, not for herself, but for her daughter's future. Ellie tucked the letter away, a small, almost imperceptible shift in her demeanor. She stood up, walking toward the window, her fingers gently brushing the glass as she looked out at the lake, just as Elaine had moments earlier. There was a sadness in her eyes, but also something else, resilience. Ellie had seen the truth, and she was ready to face the world on her own terms. "Thank you, Mom," Ellie whispered, her back still turned, her voice filled with the kind of quiet understanding only those who have known pain can recognize. Elaine's heart ached, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. Ellie knew. As the day wore on, Elaine found herself alone again, sitting at the small desk in the corner of her apartment. The letter to Ellie was one thing. Now she had a new task. She took the pen in her hand and began to write. The words came easily, flowing from her mind as if they had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be set free. She wrote the final journal entry, her hand steady, the words clear. I forgot my purse at home, but I remembered my power, and I rewrote their future the same night. She signed it, feeling a deep sense of finality. There was no more hesitation, no more waiting. She had done it. She had shaped her future, her daughter's future, and now there was nothing left to stop them. The last of the shadows had disappeared. Elaine set the pen down, taking a long breath, letting the weight of the moment settle in. She had rewritten everything, and now nothing would ever be the same again. Elaine sat back, her hand shaking slightly, but she didn't look away from the words. She had waited so long to be able to say them. But there was no emotion left in it now, just cold, deliberate resolve. Tom had agreed to witness the signing, and now, as he sat across from her in the small kitchen, the weight of the moment felt almost too heavy. She handed him the paper, his gaze serious as he read it over. He signed as the second party, no questions asked. He'd seen too much, knew too much. It was done. As the pen slid across the page for the final time, Elaine exhaled. There was nothing else to do. She couldn't make them disappear, couldn't erase the past, but she could control what came next. And what came next was something they wouldn't be prepared for. The next few days were a blur. Elaine spent her time adjusting, organizing, and trying to push the looming sense of unease to the back of her mind. The sound of Ellie's laughter echoed through the house each weekend. And for those few precious hours, it was enough. It always had been. She and Ellie had started painting birdhouses together, a simple activity that became something of a ritual. They sat at the kitchen table, the scent of paint mingling with the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of brushes against wood creating a quiet rhythm. Every weekend, Elaine looked forward to this, these moments where the world felt uncomplicated, where it was just her and Ellie, creating something new. Ellie's smile was brighter each time, but Elaine couldn't ignore the questions that lingered in the girl's eyes, the same ones that had surfaced when she first moved. Ellie had stopped asking about the changes, stopped asking when they would return to normal. Elaine knew Ellie had learned to accept the silence as well, but she also knew there were still pieces of the puzzle Ellie couldn't put together yet. She'd protect her for as long as she could. One Sunday, as they were cleaning up the paints, Elaine glanced at the clock. The evening light was starting to fade, and a sudden realization hit her like a wave. She walked to the desk and took out her phone, typing out one last message, this one to the funeral home. It was a simple instruction, but it would ensure that the final step was as airtight as the trust had become. She typed, then hit send. Please ensure my obituary does not list Sean or Renee as family. They are no longer part of my life or my legacy. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. It wasn't spite, nor was it cruelty. It was simply truth. They had forfeited their place in her life long before she had ever made the decision to step away. And now it was time to make it official. The following week, Elaine received a letter, a legal notice from Sean's lawyer, threatening to contest the will. The words on the paper were written in anger and frustration, the tone accusatory, yet Elaine felt nothing. The battle she had anticipated was finally here. She read the letter once, then twice, before setting it down calmly. They didn't know what they were up against. She tapped a finger on the edge of the table, her mind calculating. This wouldn't be a fight that drained her. It would be the last step in her path toward peace. And as the door closed, the storm still hovered on the horizon. But this time, it wouldn't reach her. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, though Elaine hadn't heard it from any of the usual sources. She didn't need to. The whispers were everywhere. Sean had filed for bankruptcy. Elaine walked past the old house one morning. the familiar windows staring back at her with their faded curtains and peeling paint. The lawn, once meticulously kept, was overgrown, the grass untrimmed, a reflection of how quickly everything had crumbled. The property sign in front of the house looked out of place now, almost mocking in its silence. An open house, but there was no crowd, no buyers. She hadn't expected to feel anything when she saw it, but there was a weight in her chest, the remnants of a life she had once shared with Sean, a life she had been suffocating in for years. And yet, seeing that house, seeing him unravel, made the hurt feel real again. Not for him, but for her, for the dreams that she had once clung to, that she had thought could be salvaged. But then, as if on cue, a low sound cut through the quiet street. A tow truck rumbled by, hauling away Renee's car, the one she had always driven with that air of careless pride. Elaine slowed for a moment, watching as the car was lifted off the ground, its tires spinning aimlessly in the air before it was hauled away. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. The car was just a symbol, one of many things that had been taken from them, and one of the last remnants of the life Sean and Renee had built. The house was gone. The car was gone. And soon, so would be any claim they had to her life. Elaine walked on, her pace steady, resolute. She didn't look back. That afternoon, Elaine sat in the cozy nook by the window. The faint sound of birds chirping in the distance, the sky a pale blue. She picked up her phone and, after a moment's hesitation, tapped out a message to Ellie. It was simple, nothing too extravagant, just a small gesture. "I thought you might like these." She attached a few books, a new sketch pad, and a fresh journal. The items felt right. Ellie had always loved to draw, to capture moments in a way that Elaine couldn't. The books were stories Elaine had hoped they could read together when the time felt right. The journal was for Ellie to write down her own thoughts, her own experiences, a way to begin the healing that was bound to come in waves. Elaine sent it off, watching the message disappear into the ether. She didn't expect a response, but she knew it would be received with love. The distance between them had been closing slowly but surely. It was late in the evening when Elaine found a small package outside her door. A handwritten note was nestled inside. She recognized Ellie's handwriting immediately, and her heart skipped as she unfolded the paper. "You're my real home." Elaine's breath caught, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Ellie had said so much with so few words. It was everything Elaine had worked for, everything she had fought for. A life where they could build their own memories, away from the toxicity, away from the manipulations. She clutched the note tightly, pressing it against her chest, as if absorbing the weight of Ellie's love. This was her home. This was the reason she had fought so hard to break free. Later that evening, as the darkness settled around her apartment, Elaine sat down at the small desk, her fingers brushing the final set of trust documents. She had been putting this off for days, needing a moment to absorb everything that had happened, needing to fully understand that she was no longer a woman waiting for the world to fall into place. She was making it fall into place. With steady hands, she signed the papers, the final legal step to ensure her future, and Ellie's, was secure. No more loose ends, no more ties to the past. The foundation was set. They couldn't take it from her now. The weight of the pen in her hand felt oddly comforting, the finality of the motion soothing. As she set the pen down, a sense of calm washed over her. There was nothing more to do but to live. The following day, Elaine found herself walking through the neighborhood again. This time, not to the house she once shared with Sean, but to the small cafe just down the street. She'd been frequenting it more lately, meeting with a few new neighbors, joining their book club meetings. There was something small but significant about these moments. They were hers, fully, wholly.